To begin, picture yourself in a quiet gallery of world history, where 10 thrones are arranged in a wide arc. No ceremonial drums, no glittering brocade, only a persistent question that refuses to age. Why did some kings marry so many wives? Sometimes a few dozen, sometimes hundreds by rumor or record. And how did entire courts revolve around that fact, as if around a central axle? Now, as you walk past each throne, you will notice that royal marriage was rarely a private romance. It was a technology of power, a rope that yokes regions to a center, a conveyor for heirs, and a form of soft diplomacy. Ironically, the most intimate spaces of a palace were the places where the state reached in the deepest. In this context, the 10 figures ahead will not be flattened into a simple top 10 list. They will serve as facets in a larger lens that shows how law and daily life, ritual and politics, turned around the same core problem of rule. To begin with the Korean peninsula, the dynasty of Goryeo opens our tour with Wang Gon, known as Taejo. He unified a fractured map and married widely across clans, with accounts noting 29 wives. Especially when a new court is fragile, the safest path is often to bind potential rivals through kinship ties. Each union becomes a soft treaty, and each dowry becomes a bridge between a throne room and a region that only recently accepted central authority. Yet a palace crowded with titles raises a familiar puzzle. Succession is not a simple arithmetic when the sons of different mothers all carry claims of blood. In this context, court law must identify the ladder of rank and the logic of inheritance. The distinctions between a chief consort and secondary consorts, between an empress and ladies of lesser degree, are not ornamental words. They are the gears that keep succession from stalling. Now move south toward mainland Southeast Asia, and you meet Siam under King Mongkut of the Chakri line. He is remembered for a long training in monastic discipline before accession, and for a court that preserved traditional polygyny while facing an age of maritime visitors and diplomatic missions. Ironically, a royal household can be a mirror for a state negotiating between cherished customs and new expectations. Especially when foreign envoys walk through palace gates, etiquette changes, and educational programs adapt. Yet the internal logic of the harem remains administrative. So positions are ranked, residences regulated, and audiences scheduled. Yet the ledger of duties and ranks cannot drain a house of feeling. In this context, every marriage carries layers of policy and preference, public face and private hopes. To begin a Vietnamese chapter, enter the early Nguyen court under Emperor Gia Long, who reunited a landscape after long years of conflict. Sources record at least 50 wives. Especially when a founder consolidates power, marriage is a strategist's rope that ties noble families to a fresh regime. Now imagine a web where each union equals a pledge that reduces the incentives to rebel. Yet a web without rules tangles easily. In this context, the court must erect a clear hierarchy to keep the domestic sphere from becoming a second battlefield. The name of a lady, the rites surrounding childbirth, the precedence of ceremonies, even the pacing of audiences, all act as social rails for a train that must never slip. Now step to Qing China for Emperor Kangxi, one of the longest reigning monarchs in East Asia. Accounts list 54 wives of graded titles. Especially when an empire balances multiple ethnic and banner identities, Marriage becomes a way to allocate honor among constituent groups. The banner system that shaped Qing society appears again in matrimonial policy. So recruitment for the inner court is ritualized, examinations and selection days are held, and the daily order of the palace is codified in detail. Yet entrance through the palace gate does not guarantee a climb. In this context, health, intellect, adaptability, and the ability to be safe in a room full of silent politics will usually count more than bare lineage. Now, if you glance at memorials and diaries, you can still see how a personal turn of fortune can reframe a political scene. To begin another turn in the Nguyen narrative, consider Emperor Tu Duc. He is connected to a very large household by record, yet he had no biological child. Ironically, that paradox haunts a system that is built to multiply heirs. Especially when filial piety defines the language of legitimacy, an empty cradle becomes a constitutional question. So adoption from a cadet branch and a carefully staged procedure of selection must carry the weight that a direct line could not provide.
We face a constitutional
Yet law
crisis.
alone cannot hush a
line of
cultural
succession
anxiety
is in
that
jeopardy.
expects a living symbol of continuity. In this context, courtiers arbitrate, rituals are tightened, and the throne must speak clearly, to steady a public imagination that links the body of the ruler with the body of the dynasty. Now widen the Vietnamese frame to Emperor Minh Mang, a molder of institutions and a patron of order. Different records preserve different counts for wives and offspring, and that variability itself teaches caution. Especially when bureaucracy is a proud project, the royal family becomes an extension of the filing cabinet. Genealogies are standardized, generation poems guide names, and the etiquette of audiences and investitures is distilled into clear procedure. So an abundant household becomes a data set for rule. Yet abundance breeds administrative costs. In this context, the inner court must maintain discipline to prevent little factions from becoming loud ones. Now a table of allowances, rewards and penalties becomes as political as a tax edict. To begin the Indian subcontinent's page, enter the world of Rajput memory with Bapa Rawal of the Marwar orbit. Tradition tells of a ruler who married many women, with figures in the realm of 140 appearing in lore. Especially when hill forts guarded small kingdoms and external pressure threatened, matrimony was both shield and bridge. Each marriage stitched a family to a military pact, and each visit by in-laws could be a planning session without minutes. Yet a historian should tread carefully when legend glows. In this context, the numbers signal an ambition and a political style more than a verified census. So read them as a contour line on a map of alliances, rather than as a ledger etched in stone. Now move west to Qajar, Iran, and stand before Fath Ali Shah, a monarch famed for courtly splendor and for a very large circle of wives in the sources, often cited at around 158, with mentions of hundreds of consorts. Ironically, the pictures that present the king among women do not simply flatter a personal taste. They display abundance as a state virtue, a visual claim that prosperity and fecundity flow from the throne. Especially when a dynasty wants to repair or elevate its prestige, spectacle becomes a policy. So weddings are stages, and processions speak a language of plenty. Yet distribution, beneath the surface, remains a cold calculation. In this context, the treasury must feed the splendor without starving the provinces. At once, positions and gifts are assigned to manage rivalries before they harden. To begin a chapter in Central Africa, you meet the kingdom in Cameroon, where Abumbi II reigns. Accounts often discuss a very high count of wives and add a crucial legal note, especially when a successor inherits not only a title but the family of his predecessor. The term many wives does not carry the same meaning as in East Asia or the Middle East. So the mathematics of marriage blends with the ethics of guardianship and continuity. Yet from a distance, a modern reader can misread an institution if the rule of inheritance is overlooked. In this context, a palace household is a civic duty, administered across reigns. Now the number points to a practice of care and stewardship, rather than to a series of romantic choices multiplied. Now unroll the map farther west into the sphere of ancient Israel and the figure of Solomon, as described in sacred text. The narrative mentions 700 wives and 300 concubines. Ironically, a scripture that uses number as symbol can speak a truth different from a registry. Especially when theological teaching is in play, magnitude can be rhetoric. So the better question is not whether the arithmetic is exact, but what the arithmetic means for the story about power, wisdom, and covenant. Yet political logic still lives in the tale. In this context, intermarriage with neighboring polities can be read as a method to pacify borders and coordinate trades. Now the story becomes a window on ancient diplomacy as much as on faith. To begin linking these portraits, set down a simple framework. 4 tasks appear again and again wherever royal polygyny was practiced. A ruler seeks to legitimate rule, to knot allies into family, to continue the line, and to project prosperity. Especially when central power rises or faces danger, the household expands as a buffer and a signal. So the number of wives is a symptom of a calculus rather than a personal quirk. Yet symptom does not mean illusion. In this context, the wedding chamber is political and the nursery is constitutional. At once, courtiers write rules, scribes draft family charts, and ceremonies choreograph the moods of an empire. Now borrow the lens of law to see how an inner court becomes a clock with many cogs. In East Asian dynasties, ranks laddered from principal consort to lower degrees, with residence, wardrobe, and audience strictly regulated. Especially when the next ruler must be predictable, ritual lines fence off desire with naming and precedence. So the status of a mother can tilt the ground under a prince. Yet law never floats outside history. In this context, famine, faction, or war can distort what a code prescribes. At once, a minister's counsel, a dowager's word, or a commander's quiet support may override rank in a critical hour. Now turn to the economy that feeds a large household. Dower, bride gifts, annual stipends, clothing allowances, and staff salaries make the home a budgetary state inside the state. Especially when a monarch like Fath Ali Shah pursued courtly theatre, the cost of looking abundant was itself a kind of tax on attention and coin. So craftspeople, merchants, and provinces felt the pull of the palace. Yet opulence without balance leaks legitimacy. In this context, treasuries responded with detailed schedules of distribution and with audits meant to keep favor from becoming disorder. At once, fairness inside the women's quarters mirrored fairness expected in the provinces. To begin a conversation about succession, compare 3 emblematic situations. Kangxi, who reigned for decades, fathered many sons and navigated a maze of expectations, talents, and backer networks before naming a successor. Tuduk, with no biological child, had to craft a solution with adoption while calming whispers about fate and virtue. Solomon, as told in scripture, anchors his rule in wisdom and burden in the symbolic language of abundance. Especially when many sons stand on the same ladder, the hinge is not a child alone, but the structure that seats him. So written edicts, teaching lines, and the sponsorship of powerful elders matter. Yet history is littered with succession scenes, where a gorgeous plan met a sudden fact. In this context, the difference between peace and turmoil might be a single death or a single rumor. Now return to Wang Jian to see how a founder used marriage to disarm geography. Clans that once held their valleys with armed men now sent daughters to a palace that promised honor. Especially when a political center is new, honor is its best currency. So a program of unions becomes a program of pacification. Yet every promise made through a wedding must be kept through policy. In this context, tax relief, appointments, and respect for local customs often had to follow the honeymoon. At once, personal life became a delivery system for statecraft. To begin again in Siam under Mongkut, notice how a court that welcomed scholarship and astronomy remained faithful to its internal traditions. Especially when the world visits with cameras and journals, a palace must translate itself. So languages are taught, audiences with foreigners are choreographed, and the image of sovereignty learns to smile without bowing. Yet that did not erase the graded life of the harem. In this context, modern knowledge arrived alongside ancient etiquette, and both were considered necessary for stability. Now the king stood at the crossing of calendars. One set kept by monks, another kept by consuls. Now rebuild the house of Min Meng with the tools of order. He prized categorization and wrote it into family life, especially when a state becomes proud of its files. Names and birthdays are recorded with a librarian's zeal. So a princely education is not a casual favor, but a curriculum. Yet the virtue of standardization brings a risk of coldness. In this context, the ruler must remember that a family is not just a dataset. At once, he uses poetry, ceremonial music, and carefully paced audiences to warm procedure into meaning. To begin a comparative detour, notice how research about these rulers handles numeric claims. Ancient texts attach big numbers to big meanings. Court records note counts with fiscal intent. Oral histories favor memory that honors heroes. Especially when we aggregate sources, the columns will not always align. So a wise reader treats numbers as signals of scale and purpose, rather than as single precise measures. Yet it is still possible to distinguish a rough order of magnitude. In this context, 700 and 300, 158, 500 or 54 stand as different rhetorical weights. At once, they tell you who wished to be seen as cosmic, who as fertile, who as disciplined, and who as richly connected. Now step briefly into the question of women's agency. A royal household was not merely a collection of dependents, but a workplace of skill. Especially when the stakes were inheritance and honor, education in etiquette, literature, and religion mattered. So a queen or a chief consort might patronize scholars, sponsor temples, or arbitrate disputes. Yet narratives that focus on the male sovereign can obscure this labor. In this context, a gendered reading is incomplete unless it recognizes that power inside a palace was often negotiated among women. At once, the daily schedule of a court could hinge on whom a dowager trusted. To begin thinking about social echoes, observe how elite behavior often flows downward. If the court embraced plural marriage, many noble houses followed, though at smaller scale and with different legalities. Especially when honor economies thrive on display, numbers become symbols for status. So a nobleman with 3 wives might feel elevated by the shadow of a king with dozens. Yet the law of the state might not always be the law of the village. In this context, a slowly modernizing jurisdiction can start to prefer monogamy in civil codes, while accepting plural forms as custom in certain groups. Now the result is a patchwork of practice that maps the complexity of change. Now recall Abumbi II and return to the difference between purchasing spouses and inheriting guardianship. Especially when oral customary law defines the rules, the public duty of a king includes care for people linked to the throne through earlier reigns. So numbers must be read as a system of responsibilities. Yet that insight is easy to lose when a headline tries to shock. In this context, the right comparison set is not a list of conquests, but a chain of officers. At once, the palace appears less as a private garden and more as a social institution with inherited obligations. To begin a chapter on ritual, follow a wedding procession in any of these courts. Steps are counted, songs are chosen, gifts are measured, and the names of ancestors are recited. Especially when the audience includes rivals, performance speaks policy. So a grand ceremony tells other elites that they are included, honored, or warned. Yet the center cannot perform without consent at the edges. In this context, tribute of cloth, jewels, or horses returns during festivals as distributions to many households. At once, a good ritual becomes a redistributive mechanism that reduces the cost of rule. Now place these cases on a timeline of legal transformation. By the 19th and 20th centuries in many regions, civil codes and international reputation pushed monarchies toward the language of one man, one wife in law, even when customs endured in private. Especially when treaties and diplomacy emphasize shared standards, courts edit their image, so photographic albums show a family small enough for a page. Yet the memory of earlier practice remains in architecture and protocol. In this context, a hall built for a large household is used for councils or schools, but its shape still whispers about a former way of life. At once, the modern nation claims the past as heritage, while rewriting its rules. Now return to the 4-part framework and test it across all 10 names. Legitimacy was often the first need for founders and restorers like Wang Jian and Jia Long. Alliances were a steady need in frontier worlds of Rajput forts and banner jurisdictions under the Qing. Heirs were a constant concern, whether abundant or painfully absent, as in the case of Tu Duc. Prosperity as spectacle was the theater of Qajar Iran and the scriptural image of Solomon. Especially when one axis weakens, another grows more visible. So a palace without a secure son leans on ritual. A palace without cash leans on kinship. Yet no axis is free of cost. In this context, every solution has a side effect that another generation must treat. At once, polygyny resolves a problem and produces new ones. To begin a final sweep, consider ethics. A modern audience often asks where justice sits in such households. Especially when you hold both a historian's lens and a citizen's lens, you will resist easy approval and easy condemnation. So you read practices in their time and measure them by the standards that people used then. But you also carry current commitments to dignity and equality. Yet the two lenses need not cancel each other. In this context, It is possible to describe a custom without praising it, and to analyze a rule while imagining a better rule. Now, the story of 10 kings becomes a study in how power uses intimacy, and how intimacy changes power in return. Now listen again to the corridors in your mind's gallery. On one throne sits Wang Gion, using marriage to weld a map. On another sits Mongkut, balancing monastic calm with worldly visitors while preserving domestic hierarchy. Nearby, Jia Long trades rings for peace among old rivals. Kang Shi oversees a machine of etiquette and rank. Tu Duck wears the quiet sorrow of a line that did not continue through his own body. Min Meng composes order and sings it into names. Baparawal glows in legend as the hub of many alliances. Fat Ali Shah displays a garden of abundance to assert state vitality. Abumbi II reminds us that inheritance can include people as duty. Solomon stands in scripture as a symbol for political reach as much as for personal romance. Especially when they are seated together, comparison corrects caricature. So the question stops being who had the largest number. It becomes what each number meant in its own city of stone and alley of rules. Yet a single thread winds through the group. Power loves to weave with the closest fabric available, which is family. In this context, royal marriage magnifies family into apparatus. It asks children to carry treaties, asks wives to carry honor, and asks rituals to carry budgets. At once, the household is a calendar, a tax list, and a map. Now, if you step back from the gallery, you can see how a private scene becomes a public archive of choices made under pressure. Especially when you sit with that awareness, the stories of these kings are no longer curiosities. They are case studies in statecraft. Now, as a last quiet exercise, ask 3 questions. Which of the 4 needs was primary in each reign? Legitimacy, alliances, heirs, or prosperity as symbol? How did the palace pay for the solution it chose? In coin, in time, or in friction? Where did women within the system exercise agency? In patronage, in education, or in the arbitration of rank? Especially when you look for those answers, the gallery stops being about tall stacks of names and becomes a seminar about design under constraint. So a simple count turns into a deep map. Yet the map is never finished, because new documents surface and new methods of reading are invented. In this context, the best you can do is return with patience and add annotations. In the end, the 10 thrones return to shadow. You leave with an understanding that a royal wedding was a policy instrument, that a nursery could be a parliament in miniature, and that a procession could be a tax policy set to music. Ironically, the quieter you listen, the more a palace stops sounding like romance and starts sounding like administration. Especially when you place these insights next to the legal and ethical frameworks of today, you are reminded that family and state should not be allowed to swallow each other. So the histories become guides for separation of spheres, for the defense of individual dignity, and for tempering the temptation to use intimacy as leverage. Yet they also preserve the memory of people who lived within systems they did not always choose. In this context, to study these kings is to study constraint. At once, you carry away a sober respect for human ingenuity, and a desire to design gentler institutions. Now, the gallery door closes. The air outside feels modern and free, but inside your head, the steps of queens, consorts, and attendants continue along tiled corridors. Especially when we tell their stories with care, we do justice to the complexity of the past, without turning away from the values we hold now. So the list that began as a headline becomes an education. Yet education is not an ending. In this context, it is a beginning, a way to approach any claimed number or custom with context, with empathy, and with the insistence that power can be bound to fairness. In the end, that may be the best use of a gallery full of crowns.